There is exactly one word this world's golden faith reserves for its very worst sin, and that word is not murder, and it is not heresy in the ordinary sense. That word is blasphemy, and it belongs, specifically and almost exclusively, to a single demigod who chose to fuse himself with a serpent rather than remain a son of the golden line. So, why does a religion built around a golden tree reserve its harshest possible judgment for snakes? Why do serpent carvings turn up quietly on the oldest and most sacred architecture this world has to offer, hidden in plain sight for anyone patient enough to look? Why does an exiled prince across the sea keep an entire serpent leashed inside his own body rather than killing it? And why, when this world's founding goddess is examined closely enough, do her own oldest associations keep circling back to the very creature her finished religion claims to despise the most? Tonight, we go looking for every serpent this world has quietly buried, in carvings, in bloodlines, in one demigod's transformed and monstrous body, because the closer you look at how consistently snakes are tied to the worst possible sin, the less it resembles disgust, and the more it resembles fear, the particular fear a newer faith reserves for whatever came directly before it. This is a long, slow telling, and you do not have to hold any of it tightly. If your eyes close somewhere in the coils, that is exactly what this was built for. Chapter 1. The word blasphemy only means one thing here. Search this world's surviving texts for the word blasphemy, and you will find it attached again and again to a single figure, Rykard, styled directly and specifically as Lord of Blasphemy, a title this world does not extend to any other demigod, however monstrous their own individual sins eventually became. Moog kidnaps and ritually binds his own half-brother. Rykard is never called a blasphemer for that. Melania's rot devastates an entire region. Nobody calls her a blasphemer either. The word attaches cleanly and consistently to exactly one demigod and to exactly one choice he made, fusing himself permanently with a serpent. That specificity deserves real attention, because this world is not typically shy about naming violence, curse, or cruelty in plain, direct language when it wants you to understand a character has done something genuinely terrible. Blasphemy is a different category of word entirely, carried deliberately at a considerable remove from the ordinary vocabulary this world otherwise uses freely. It does not simply mean sin. It means a sin committed specifically against sacred order, a violation not of ordinary morality, but of religious boundary, the kind of transgression of faith reserves for whoever reaches toward the one thing that faith has decided must never, under any circumstances, be touched or honored again. Consider what that implies about the serpent itself. A faith does not typically need a specific, dedicated word for the sin of associating with something it considers simply beneath notice. Blasphemy is the vocabulary of genuine threat, the label applied to whatever a religion is most afraid its own believers might quietly find themselves drawn back toward. If the Golden Order truly considered serpents nothing more than base, unworthy creatures, contempt alone would have been sufficient language. Instead, it reached for its single harshest word, reserved this single time for this single demigod who chose this single creature above every other possible source of forbidden power available to him. That choice of language is the first real clue tonight has to offer. Whatever the serpent actually represents in this world's oldest buried history, the Golden Order does not appear to consider it simply unworthy. It appears to consider it dangerous, in the specific way that only a genuine rival faith, buried but never quite finished, can actually be. Before meeting the man who earned that word directly, there is a wider vocabulary worth mapping first, because the Golden Faith apparently reserves an entire hierarchy of distinct words for its distinct categories of transgression, and understanding where blasphemy actually sits within that hierarchy tells you something before you ever meet the man who earned it. This world's careful language distinguishes several separate categories of wrongdoing, heresy, treason, and blasphemy chief among them, each carrying its own distinct weight and its own distinct target. Heresy tends to describe doctrinal disagreement, disputes over correct belief and correct practice within the Golden Faith's own broad framework, punishable but survivable, the kind of disagreement an institution can eventually absorb or outlast. Treason describes political betrayal, disloyalty to the throne or the capital's own authority, serious but ultimately a crime against structure rather than against the sacred itself. Blasphemy sits apart from both, reserved specifically for offenses against the sacred order's own foundational nature, rather than against its doctrine or its political structure. Consider what it means that this world bothered to maintain such a precise distinction at all, rather than simply lumping every serious transgression under one broad label of wrongdoing. A faith this careful about vocabulary is a faith that understood, clearly, that not every threat to its authority looked the same, and that the threat posed by reaching back toward whatever it had displaced deserved a category entirely its own, distinct from mere disagreement or mere disloyalty. Precision like this rarely emerges by accident. It emerges from lived, institutional experience, a faith that has already, at some point in its own history, needed to distinguish clearly between someone who simply disagreed and someone who reached backward towards something considerably more dangerous. We are going to meet the man who earned that specific, harshest word directly and understand exactly what he actually became. There is a structural point worth making before we go looking for the man himself, because it governs everything that follows tonight. Blasphemy is not a description of an act. It is a description of a relationship. Murder can be committed against anyone, and this world's histories are thick with it, committed by the golden line as freely as against it. Heresy is a disagreement about doctrine, and the Golden Order has tolerated a startling amount of that, up to and including entire academies teaching sorceries drawn from a rival cosmology in a lake the capital could see from its own walls. Blasphemy is narrower than either. It is what you are charged with when you do not merely break the Order's rules, but stand outside its authority to make rules at all. It is the word a religion reaches for when confronted with something that predates it and does not accept its jurisdiction. And that is precisely why the charge lands on a serpent, and on the one man who let one into his body, and almost nowhere else in this entire world. One more thing about the word before we go looking for the man, because it is the detail that makes the rest of tonight worth doing at all. Blasphemy is a charge that requires a claimant. Murder needs only a victim, and heresy needs only a doctrine, but blasphemy needs somebody standing up and asserting that a particular authority has been offended. It is the one accusation in this world's vocabulary that says as much about the accuser as the accused, because to level it, you must first insist that your God's jurisdiction extends over the thing you are pointing at. So every time this world reaches for that word, it is doing two things at once. It is condemning a serpent, and it is quietly asserting that serpents fall under the Erdtree's authority in the first place. The vehemence of the first claim tends to distract from how much weight is being carried by the second, and the second is the one that turns out by the end of tonight to be considerably harder to defend. Chapter 2: The General Who Devoured a Dragon and Became a Snake. Rykard, born of Renala, and the divided being known as Radagon and Marika both, grew up in the wreckage of his own father's overnight abandonment, alongside Radon and Rani, each of them working out that inherited grief in radically different directions, where Radon channeled his own inheritance into raw, celebrated strength, and Rani channeled hers into patient, calculated escape. Rykard chose something considerably stranger and considerably more total. He sought out the god-devouring serpent, an ancient power capable of consuming gods themselves, and rather than simply wielding that power, he let it consume him in turn, merging so completely with the resulting form that almost nothing recognizably human remains of him by the time you actually meet him. The specific creature he merged with matters here because it was not originally a serpent at all. Fortissax, an ancient dragon, one of this world's oldest and most powerful beings, was itself consumed and twisted by the god-devouring serpent's own hunger before Rykard ever arrived to complete his own transformation. This is worth sitting with directly. Rykard did not simply gain serpent power. He joined a chain of consumption already generations deep, a dragon devoured into serpent form, and then a demigod devoured into that same serpent form afterward, each layer folding an older, more powerful being into the same hungry, coiling shape. Consider what this tells you about the serpent's actual nature, rather than simply its symbolic weight. This is not a single creature. It is closer to a process, a hunger capable of consuming and absorbing power from whatever it swallows, growing larger and more complex with each layer folded into it. Rykard's own remaining human upper half, barely visible atop the serpent's own coiled mass, is simply the newest, freshest layer added to something that was already ancient and already devouring long before he ever arrived to add himself to it. His own domain, Volcano Manor, operates as an elaborate deception the entire time, presenting a noble household serving the Golden Order faithfully while secretly hunting down heretics on Rykard's own behalf, feeding them to him one by one under cover of righteous purges his own loyal followers seem genuinely unaware they are actually performing. That deception matters because it means Rykard's blasphemy was never simply a private transformation hidden away where it could do no further harm. It was actively, deliberately extended outward, an entire household unknowingly serving a god the Golden Order had already named its single worst possible sin. Consider, too, the specific choice sitting inside Renala's own three children's separate responses to the exact same abandonment. This telling has already named Radahn's strength and Ranni's escape as two available directions, but Rykard's own choice deserves to be set beside them plainly rather than simply summarized in passing. Where his siblings each found some way to keep functioning as recognizably themselves within this world's existing structure, however painfully, Rykard chose to leave that structure behind entirely, discarding not just his own inherited grief, but his own inherited shape along with it. Of three children raised in the wreckage of the same overnight abandonment, only one chose to stop being, in any recognizable sense, a person at all. Before we look at the household that unknowingly served this hunger, there is one earlier casualty of it worth naming properly, a being who lost everything long before Rykard ever arrived to add himself to the same devouring shape. It is worth pausing on what Rykard gave up, because the histories are unusually quiet about it, and the quiet is informative. He was a general. He held a great rune. He had a legitimate claim in the war that consumed his family, and by any ordinary reading of ambition, he had every reason to pursue that claim in the ordinary way, with armies and alliances and the machinery his brother Radahn used so effectively. He chose instead a route that made him permanently ineligible for the throne he might have taken. Whatever he became inside that serpent could never sit on the Elden throne, could never be Elden Lord, could never be the thing the Shattering was ostensibly fought over. That is not the behavior of a man playing the same game as everybody else and cheating. It is the behavior of a man who looked at the board, decided the game itself was the problem, and went looking for something that operated by different rules entirely. It is worth sitting with one more consequence of what he did, because it reframes the entire household that grew up around him. Rykard did not simply acquire a monstrous body. He acquired an appetite that has to be fed, continuously, forever, by other people's deaths. Whatever he was before, he is now a mouth with an estate attached, and every noble intrigue and righteous purge conducted in that manner is ultimately logistics for a feeding schedule. That is the part the blasphemy charge tends to obscure. The Golden Order condemns him for what he merged with, as a category error, a violation of proper form. The more disturbing objection is simpler and has nothing to do with theology. He built an institution whose actual function, hidden beneath its manners and its recruitment and its talk of purpose, is to deliver a steady supply of human beings into something that will never stop being hungry. Chapter 3: What Fortissax Actually Was. Before Rykard, before Volcano Manor, before any demigod's own private blasphemy gave this hunger a face this world would eventually learn to fear, Fortissax existed as an ancient dragon, one of this world's oldest and most formidable beings, guardian of Farum Azula, bound in service to Plasphemous, the ancient dragon lord, broken and alone in a floating ruin most players never think to fully explore. His own name, carried forward into this world's present day, scattered across item descriptions and half-remembered lore, is one of the few surviving proper names attached to this entire chain of consumption. A dragon, significant enough once to be individually remembered rather than simply folded anonymously into the god-devouring serpent's own growing, nameless mass. Somewhere in this world's oldest, least documented history, Fortissax was consumed, twisted by the god-devouring serpent's own hunger into something no longer recognizable as the dragon he once was, an apex predator, ancient and formidable in his own right, reduced to raw material for a considerably older and considerably hungrier power. This detail deserves real weight before you move on to Rykard's own, more famous transformation, because it establishes something crucial about the scale of what you are actually dealing with tonight. The god-devouring serpent did not simply tempt a lonely, grieving demigod into forbidden power. It had already, long before Rykard was ever born, proven itself capable of consuming beings this world otherwise treats as nearly unstoppable. Consider what it means that Rykard's own transformation, monstrous and total as it clearly is, was never actually the hunger's first meal. He was the newest layer added to something that had already devoured an ancient dragon and kept growing regardless, patient, hungry, and apparently entirely unconcerned with how formidable its next intended victim happened to be. Whatever this power actually is, it was never simply waiting for a convenient demigod to stumble across it. It had already been feeding quietly for considerably longer than this family's entire recorded history, and Fortissax's own lost, twisted form is the clearest surviving proof of exactly how far back that feeding actually reaches. Before turning toward the household that unknowingly served the same hunger, there is a bond worth naming more fully, the specific relationship Fortissax once carried to Plasphemous, because it deepens the tragedy of his own loss considerably further than a simple predator to prey account ever could. Plasphemous, the broken dragon lord still waiting alone in Farum Azula's floating ruin, once commanded Fortissax directly, master to servant, in whatever draconic hierarchy governed this world's oldest age, before the Golden Order ever rose to displace it. Consider what Plasphemous' own fractured, divided nature, split and unstable by the time you actually reach him, might owe to the loss of exactly the servant this telling has just traced into the god-devouring serpent's own hungry coils. This reading deserves to be offered carefully rather than as settled fact, since this world's own text never directly states that Fortissax's consumption caused Plasphemous' own fracturing. What can be said with confidence is that the timeline fits uncomfortably well. An ancient ruler, once whole enough to command an entire draconic hierarchy, now found broken, divided, and alone, guarding a floating ruin that once housed considerably more than a single fractured survivor. If Fortissax's loss to the Serpent's own hunger genuinely predates Placidusax's own fracturing, then this world's oldest ruler may carry his own quiet grief, considerably older and considerably less discussed than anything this family's own more famous golden tragedy ever produced. For a servant that vanished into exactly the same hunger tonight has spent so long tracing. Consider what it would mean if this reading holds that this world's very oldest recorded grief and this world's very newest, best documented tragedy trace back to the exact same devouring hunger, separated by an age so vast this world's own official history barely bothers connecting them. Placidusax mourning a lost servant, and centuries later, Renala and her children mourning a lost son and brother, both losses ultimately owed to the same patient, coiling power, still feeding, still growing, all the way from this world's oldest dragon age through to its own current, fractured present. Before looking at the household that unknowingly served the same hunger, there is a considerably older tradition worth naming, one this world quietly keeps separate from the serpent thread, even though both trace back to roughly the same age. Hold that chain of consumption in mind, because it inverts the usual direction of power in this world. Everywhere else, power is granted downward. The greater will grants authority to Marika. Marika grants great runes to her children. The Erd tree grants grace to the tarnished. The whole golden apparatus is a hierarchy of things handed down from above, and the recipient is always diminished relative to the giver. The serpent does the opposite. It takes upward. It consumes a dragon and becomes larger. It consumes a demigod and becomes larger again. Nothing is granted, nothing is bestowed, and nothing arrives with conditions attached. That is a genuinely different theory of how power moves through a world, and it is the reason the Golden Order cannot simply file this away as another heresy to be corrected. A heresy misunderstands the hierarchy. This rejects the existence of one. Chapter 4. Two older powers, not one. Scattered across this world, cathedrals dedicated to dragon communion let travelers commune directly with draconic power, absorbing hearts torn from fallen dragons in exchange for incantations tied to breath and scale and ancient reptilian strength. This tradition predates the Golden Order by a considerable stretch. Tied to an age of dragon lords, this world's official history treats as a displaced, mostly forgotten predecessor rather than an ongoing rival faith. It is worth naming directly before this telling goes any further that dragon worship and serpent worship are not, so far as this world's own text ever confirms, the same tradition wearing two different masks. They appear to be two genuinely separate older powers, both older than the golden light, both partially buried by it, each with its own distinct iconography, its own distinct rituals, its own distinct relationship to the demigods who eventually drew on either one. Consider what it means that this world's oldest layers were never simply one buried faith waiting to be rediscovered. They were apparently plural dragons and serpents and whatever older shamanic capacity runs through Marika's own bloodline, each occupying its own separate corner of a spiritual landscape considerably richer and considerably more contested than the Golden Order's own singular triumphant narrative ever admits. The Golden Faith did not simply defeat one rival and claim uncontested authority. It appears to have outsurvived, or perhaps simply outmarketed, an entire ecosystem of older competing traditions, absorbing pieces of some, driving others fully underground, and leaving enough scattered evidence of all of them that a patient enough traveler can still, centuries later, piece together roughly how crowded this world's spiritual history actually once was, layer folded quietly over layer, each one waiting patiently for someone willing to dig deep enough to notice it was ever there. There is a detail worth naming that keeps dragon worship and serpent worship distinct rather than collapsing them into one convenient category. Dragon communion remains throughout this entire story, openly practiced, its cathedrals functioning, its clergy still tending flame and offering their rites to any traveler willing to approach respectfully. Serpent worship enjoys no such open tolerance. Rykard's own practice of it required an entire household's worth of elaborate deception to survive undetected. That asymmetry matters. Whatever specifically made serpent worship considerably more dangerous or considerably more threatening to the Golden Order than dragon worship ever was, the difference was never simply about age or origin. Both traditions are old, so only one of them earned this world's single harshest word. Consider one further asymmetry worth naming before moving on. Dragon communion, however old, never produced a rival claim to the Golden Throne itself, its practitioners channeling draconic strength without ever threatening to replace the Elden Lord's own succession the way Rykard's own blasphemy directly did. Serpent worship, by contrast, reached directly into the family line, consuming a demigod rather than simply arming an outside practitioner. That distinction may explain the asymmetry more precisely than simple age or origin ever could. Dragon worship stayed external, a tool available to outsiders. Serpent worship went internal, reaching into the golden bloodline itself and claiming one of its own sons entirely. A faith can tolerate an external rival considerably more comfortably than it can tolerate a rival capable of consuming its own succession from within. Consider, too, what it means that ordinary tarnished, this world's own careful design confirms, can freely practice dragon communion themselves, without punishment, without hidden ritual, simply by approaching the right cathedral and offering the right heart. No equivalent open path exists anywhere in this world for serpent worship. That structural difference, one tradition offered openly to any traveler, the other locked away, practiced only in secret by a single demigod and his unknowing household, tells you plainly which of these two older powers the Golden Order genuinely fears enough to keep sealed away from ordinary hands. We are going to look more closely at the household that unknowingly served this same hunger next and understand exactly what it actually means to serve a blasphemous god without ever fully realizing it. The separation between these two older powers is worth holding on to because this world's own writing keeps them apart with real care, and that care is itself evidence. Dragons are of the sky. Their worship is open, their remains are monumental, their cult is permitted to persist in the open air at a shrine anyone can visit. The Golden Order defeated them and then let them keep a temple. Serpents are of the earth, of the underneath, of the places you reach by descending. Their worship is not permitted anywhere. Their remains are not monumental, and no shrine exists for them at all. The order that beat the dragons could afford to be generous because a defeated sky god is a trophy. The order that beat whatever the serpent represents could not afford generosity, and the difference in treatment is the clearest single measure of which of the two it actually feared. One more distinction is worth drawing between these two older powers, because it explains why only one of them still has followers in the open. Dragon worship survives because dragons can be worshipped safely. They are enormous, visible, defeated, and entirely external to the person doing the worshipping. You can trade a heart for a piece of their power and remain yourself afterward. The transaction has an edge to it, and the Golden Order tolerates that edge because tolerance costs it nothing. Serpent power does not work that way in any account this world offers. It does not lend, it incorporates. Everyone tonight who has come near it has ended up structurally changed by the contact, from a demigod down to the household staff. A faith can permit a cult that trades favors with a dead sky god. It cannot permit a power that dissolves the boundary between the worshipper and the thing worshipped, because a religion depends absolutely on that boundary staying where it was put. Chapter 5: The House That Serves a Different God. Volcano Manor presents itself to any outsider passing through as a noble household loyal to the Golden Order, its members respected, its purpose apparently aligned with the wider faith's own values, hunting down heretics and troublemakers on behalf of a capital that trusts its judgment. That presentation is, this world eventually reveals, almost entirely theater, a convenient cover story, letting Rykard's own hunger operate undetected in plain sight, dressed in language the Golden Faith would never think to question. Notice what this arrangement actually required to function for as long as it clearly did. An entire household of loyal servants, hunters, and knights, performing righteous duty on behalf of a lord whose true nature would horrify them if they ever fully understood it, suggests this world's oldest buried faiths do not simply survive in isolated ruins and forgotten caves. They survive by hiding inside the Golden Faith's own respectable institutions, borrowing its language, its structure, its apparent legitimacy, while quietly serving something the Golden Faith itself would name blasphemous if it ever looked closely enough to recognize what was actually happening beneath its own trusted household's polished surface. This deserves to reframe how carefully you should read every other seemingly loyal institution scattered across this world. If Volcano Manor could serve a devouring serpent for years while presenting itself as a faithful arm of the Golden Order, the Golden Faith's own confidence in knowing exactly who serves it and who does not was never as secure as its own official teaching liked to pretend. Blasphemy on this reading was never simply a rare, isolated failure. It was a threat capable of hiding inside the faith's own respectable structures indefinitely, waiting patiently for outsiders to stop looking closely enough to notice. Consider, too, the sheer administrative discipline this deception must have actually required to sustain. Hunters recruited, dispatched, and quietly folded back into a household that presented itself to every outside eye as an entirely legitimate arm of golden justice. That level of sustained, coordinated deception does not happen by accident. It requires planning, oversight, and considerable patience, further evidence that Rykard's own blasphemy was never simply a private madness he alone indulged. It was an operation deliberately structured to survive scrutiny, built by someone or several someones who understood exactly how to make forbidden worship look, from the outside, like nothing more than faithful service. Before traveling across the sea, there is a specific figure worth naming within this same household, one whose own loyalty complicates the simple picture of unknowing servants this telling has just offered. Not every member of Volcano Manor's household served Rykard's own hunger in ignorance. At least one figure of real authority within that household, a woman entrusted with recruiting and directing the manor's own hunters, appears to have understood considerably more about her lord's actual nature than the ordinary rank-and-file soldiers ever did, coordinating the household's secret purges with a precision and a calm that suggests genuine knowledge rather than simple, faithful obedience. Consider what her own knowing complicity actually adds to everything this telling has already gathered. A household entirely deceived would suggest the serpent's own survival depended purely on secrecy, an accident of ignorance, rather than genuine devotion. A household with at least one fully informed, willing collaborator suggests something considerably more troubling, that Rykard's own blasphemy found not just unwitting servants, but genuine believers, people who understood exactly what they were serving and chose to serve it anyway. That distinction matters for understanding how deeply this older, buried tradition actually managed to root itself back into the Golden Faith's own respectable institutions, not merely surviving through deception alone, but through at least some genuine chosen loyalty as well, offered freely by someone who apparently found something worth serving in exactly the power her own golden upbringing should have taught her to fear. Before traveling across the sea, there's a specific choice worth naming, one this world actually hands directly to any tarnished willing to walk deep enough into Volcano Manor's own hidden hierarchy, the choice of whether to serve Rykard's household or work to expose it. Deep enough within Volcano Manor's own questline, a tarnished can choose to align directly with the household's own hunters, taking up their bloody work, or instead pursue the path that eventually exposes and ends Rykard's own hidden blasphemy entirely. This choice matters considerably more than a simple gameplay branch, because it means this world does not simply narrate the Serpent's own hidden survival passively. It hands you directly the exact same choice every other loyal servant within that household already faced without ever fully realizing it. Serve faithfully, or look closely enough to understand what faithful service actually requires. Consider what it means that this world trusts its own players with a choice this morally loaded, rather than simply forcing a single predetermined outcome. Every NPC serving Rykard unknowingly, every knight and hunter tonight, has already traced through this household's own elaborate deception. Never got the chance you are given here, informed choice, made with full knowledge of what is actually being served. That asymmetry between your own informed agency and their own unknowing service deserves to sit with you as you decide, because it means whichever path you eventually choose, you are choosing it with a clarity that this world's own fictional inhabitants were by design never permitted to have. Consider, too, what it means that choosing to serve the household rather than expose it does not read within this world's own careful moral architecture as simple villainy. The hunters themselves are not written as monsters. They are written as people doing what they genuinely believe is righteous work, hunting heretics on behalf of an order they trust completely. A tarnished choosing to join them, even with full knowledge of what actually lies beneath the surface, is choosing complicity with open eyes rather than committing straightforward evil. This world rarely offers its players a choice this morally layered, and it deserves to be recognized as one of the more genuinely uncomfortable decisions this entire story ever quietly hands you. There is a considerably humbler thread worth pulling next, because Rykard was never the only person this power ever touched. What makes Volcano Manor genuinely unsettling, once you have seen the whole shape of it, is how closely its methods resemble the institution it is supposedly opposed to. It identifies people who do not fit. It dispatches quiet agents to remove them. It wraps the removal in the language of righteousness, so the people performing it can believe they are serving order rather than appetite. That is, almost line for line, a description of how the Golden Order handles those who live in death and the omen in every population it has decided is surplus. The manor is not the opposite of the capital. It is the capital's own logic, run for a different god, with the pretense removed by one layer and the honesty increased by exactly that much. Both are feeding something at the center. Only one of them admits that the feeding is the point. There is a final detail about the household worth naming, because it is the one that tends to unsettle people most on reflection. The manor's recruits are not villains. They are given a purpose, a place to belong, a set of targets described as deserving, and a superior who speaks warmly of the work. Everything about the arrangement is designed so that a decent person could participate for years without ever arriving at an accurate description of what they were doing. That is not a fantasy invention. It is the ordinary machinery by which institutions get ordinary people to do things those people would refuse if the request were stated plainly. Volcano Manor is the most honest depiction in this entire world of how that machinery actually works, and its honesty is precisely why it is uncomfortable. The blasphemy at the center of the house is not really the serpent. It is the discovery that sincerity and belonging are sufficient to keep a feeding operation staffed indefinitely. Chapter 6. the ordinary people who turn into snakes. Scattered across this world's caves and forgotten ruins, humanoid serpent folk wait in the dark, coiled bodies dragging along stone floors, some wielding crude weapons, some simply hissing at intruders with whatever remains of a voice their transformation left them. This world's own text never bothers to fully explain who these figures originally were before they became this, and that silence is worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because it suggests something considerably more widespread than a single demigod's own singular blasphemy. Consider what it means that this world scatters ordinary, unnamed people already partway transformed into serpents across so many of its forgotten corners, entirely separate from Rykard's own famous singular fusion. If Rykard's transformation required a specific ritual, a specific ancient serpent, a specific act of total surrender, these scattered figures suggest the underlying power does not actually require any of that specificity to take hold. It may simply be present, quietly, in certain places, certain waters, certain old ruins, waiting to slowly claim whoever spends long enough exposed to it, the way rot claims a body regardless of whether that body ever chose exposure to begin with. This detail widens everything tonight has already traced considerably further than a single blasphemous lord and a single exiled prince. The serpent's older, buried nature was never confined neatly to two named significant men whose stories this world bothers to tell in detail. It was apparently available to anyone unlucky enough to wander too close to wherever it still lingers. Ordinary people, unnamed and unmourned, slowly losing whatever made them recognizably themselves, one scale at a time. In caves, most travelers walk straight past without ever wondering who these creatures originally were before the transformation finished claiming them, entirely unremarked, entirely unmourned by anyone who might once have known their names. Consider, too, the specific locations these transformed figures tend to cluster around: forgotten tunnels, flooded cellars, and the deep, damp places most travelers actively avoid rather than wander into by accident. That pattern deserves to be read as more than simple environmental convenience. Water and darkness recur across nearly every trace of this older tradition. Tonight has gathered so far the serpent hunter's own crossbow offered near a snowbound sanctuary, Rykard's own domain sitting atop volcanic caverns, these transformed figures clustering in wet, sunless tunnels. Whatever this power actually is, it appears to prefer exactly the kind of hidden, overlooked geography the Golden Faith's own sun-bright architecture was built specifically to avoid. Consider, too, what it means that this world never gives you a single confirmed account of the actual moment of transformation, no witness testimony, no diary entry describing the slow, horrifying process of watching your own body change. That absence deserves real weight. Every other transformation tonight has traced Ricard's Godric's grafting elsewhere in this family's story, comes wrapped in at least some surrounding context, a decision, a ritual, a reason. These ordinary serpent folk offer none of that. They simply exist, already transformed, their own before and after permanently severed from any narrative thread a traveler could follow back to its beginning. Whatever claimed them did so quietly enough and thoroughly enough that not even this world's own considerable talent for scattering fragmentary evidence managed to preserve a single clear account of how it actually happened. Before traveling across the sea, there is one smaller, stranger cousin of this same tradition worth naming, a creature considerably less monstrous than a demigod's own total transformation, but no less consistently serpentine in its own quiet way. Scattered across volcanic ground and frozen expanse alike, a family of scaled, low-slung creatures wait among rocks and rubble, capable of a specific, unnerving, petrifying gaze that turns flesh to stone in a manner considerably closer to old myth than to anything this world's more ordinary monsters typically demonstrate. These creatures share no confirmed lineage with Rykard's own transformation, and this telling will not claim one where the text itself offers none. What they do share consistently is territory, appearing again and again in exactly the same volcanic and buried regions already established tonight as strongholds of this world's older, serpent adjacent power. Consider what it means that this world populated its most serpent saturated territory, with creatures carrying an ancient, mythologically loaded ability, turning living flesh to stone, an association considerably older than this specific game, and taste across countless older traditions this world clearly draws inspiration from, to serpentine and reptilian monsters, specifically. Whether or not these particular creatures share Rykard's own bloodline, their presence in exactly the regions already established as serpent territory suggests this world's designers understood the association well enough to seed it consistently, atmosphere reinforcing lore even where the text itself declines to draw the connection explicitly. Consider, too, what petrification itself might represent, held up against everything else tonight has gathered about transformation and consumption. Where the serpent's own central hunger consumes and absorbs, turning victims into fresh layers folded into its own growing shape, petrification does something considerably colder, freezing a victim permanently in place rather than incorporating them into anything larger. If both abilities genuinely trace back to some shared older tradition, they may represent two separate faces of the exact same underlying power, one that consumes forward, growing larger with every victim, and one that simply stops time entirely for whoever it touches, neither quite killing nor quite sparing, leaving its victims suspended forever in whatever moment the gaze happened to catch them. We are traveling now across the sea to meet a second figure whose relationship to the same serpent power looks nothing like Rykard's total surrender to it. There is a grim symmetry worth naming in what happens to these ordinary people, because it mirrors, at a much smaller scale, what happened to the demigod at the top of this chapter. Rykard chose his transformation, sought it out, and arrived at the serpent deliberately. The people who serve his household did not choose anything. The change arrives, works through them, and leaves something that is no longer entirely a person. That distinction matters for how you read the serpent's nature. A power that only ever took volunteers would be one thing. A power that also spreads, quietly, through proximity and service, and the ordinary business of belonging to a household, is another thing entirely. It suggests the serpent is less a bargain being offered than a condition being caught, and that everyone in the manor, believers and unwitting servants alike, has already been standing much closer to it than they understood. Chapter 7: The Prince Who Keeps a Serpent Leashed. In the land of shadow, an exiled prince named Messmer rules from concealment, and coiled somewhere inside or alongside his own body, restrained rather than fully unleashed, an enormous serpent waits, kept sealed under conditions this world never fully explains, but consistently emphasizes as deliberate and controlled. Where Rykard let his own serpent consume him entirely, merging until almost nothing separately human remained, Messmer appears to have chosen the opposite relationship to the exact same kind of power, containment rather than surrender, discipline rather than devouring. This distinction matters enormously for how you should understand what Messmer's own exile actually represents. He was not, this world's scattered evidence suggests, cast out simply for failing the Golden Order, the way Godfrey once was. He may have been cast out specifically because of his connection to this older, serpent-adjacent power, sent far from the Golden Capital, not as punishment alone, but as a kind of quarantine, keeping whatever he carries safely contained across an entire sea's worth of distance from anywhere the Golden Faith actually needs to protect. Whether that exile was chosen for him, or in some quieter way, chosen by him as the only viable path forward, this world never fully clarifies, and the ambiguity itself feels deliberate. And yet notice what he chooses to do with that exile once it is imposed on him. He does not abandon his serpent the way a truly repentant, fully golden prince might have been expected to. He keeps it close, controlled, woven directly into his own fighting style and his own fire-wreathed authority over the land of shadow, ruling an entire hidden region while still, quietly, carrying the exact kind of power his own family's faith named its single worst possible sin. Whatever exile was meant to accomplish, it did not actually separate him from the serpent at all. It simply moved that relationship somewhere. The golden capital would not have to watch it happen. Consider, too, the specific physical arrangement of that containment. A serpent bound close enough to remain part of him, released fully only in his own fight's most desperate final moments. That arrangement suggests something worth naming plainly, that Messmer's own restraint was never actually passive. It required constant, active discipline, a demigod spending every single day of his exile, actively holding something back that clearly wanted, given the ferocity of its eventual release, to be let loose considerably sooner than he ever allowed it to be. Whatever peace his exile granted him, it was never the peace of a threat neutralized. It was the considerably more exhausting peace of a threat managed continuously at real and ongoing personal cost. We are going to look closer now at what that controlled, disciplined relationship to serpent power actually looks like in practice. Messmer's own fighting style fuses fire and serpent imagery so thoroughly that separating the two becomes difficult. Spears wreathed in flame, soldiers under his command carrying the same combined aesthetic, an entire military identity built around the pairing of two elements that on the surface have little obvious reason to belong together this consistently, and yet feel, once you have gathered everything else, tonight has already traced, almost inevitable in retrospect. Consider what this fusion might actually represent, rather than simply how striking it looks in battle. Fire, throughout this world's wider mythology, tends to represent destruction, purification, and sometimes, in its most extreme form, the total negation offered by the frenzied flame. Serpents, this entire night has been arguing, represent something closer to an older, buried, patient power, hunger, and transformation, rather than simple destruction. Messmer's own combination of the two suggests a demigod who has found a way to wield a destruction and older, forbidden power together, disciplined into a single, coherent military identity, rather than left to consume him the way it eventually consumed Rykard entirely. There is a control in that combination worth naming directly, because it separates Messmer from nearly everyone else. This world has already shown you struggling with some version of the family's inherited wound. He has not simply survived his own dangerous inheritance. He has weaponized it precisely, deliberately, building an entire army and an entire regional authority out of exactly the power his own family's faith would call blasphemous if it ever looked closely enough to recognize what he had actually built with it. Consider, too, what it means that his soldiers themselves carry this combined aesthetic rather than Messmer alone, an entire trained fighting force adopting fire and serpent imagery as its own shared collective identity. That detail suggests something worth sitting with, that whatever power Messmer himself carries privately has been translated deliberately into something an entire army could adopt openly, without any of them needing to understand or carry his own literal, coiled inheritance themselves. He built a symbol out of a secret, and then handed that symbol to soldiers who could wear it proudly, without ever needing to know what it actually, originally meant. Before looking at what Messmer actually did with that army, there is a mechanical counterpart worth naming, a guardian this world built specifically to answer draconic and serpentine power with cold, deliberate engineering rather than with borrowed magic. The contrast between the two men is the sharpest thing this whole night has to offer, and it is worth stating plainly before we move on. Rykard opened himself and let the serpent in, and what remains of him is a mouth. Messmer holds one inside himself and does not let it out, and what remains of him is a man in armor carrying a spear. Both of them are, by the Golden Order's own definitions, contaminated by the same power. Only one of them is called Blasphemous. The difference is not the presence of the serpent, which both share. The difference is obedience. Messmer's serpent is leashed in service of a crusade the Golden Line ordered him to conduct. Rykard's is leashed to nothing at all. What the word blasphemy is actually measuring, then, is not corruption. It is whose purposes the corruption has been pointed at. Chapter 8. The Order's own answer to the Serpent. Scattered across regions where dragon worship and older buried traditions run deepest, hulking constructs fuse draconic remains with mechanical armor and weaponry, built rather than born, wielding massive ballistae and crude, overwhelming force against anything that threatens the ground they patrol. These constructs represent something worth setting directly beside everything tonight has already gathered about Rykard's own total organic surrender and Messmer's own disciplined living containment. Here's a third model entirely, power neither surrendered to nor merely restrained, but stripped down, mechanized, and rebuilt from the ground up into something the Golden Faith could actually control without requiring any living creature to carry the burden of restraint personally. Consider what it means that this world felt the need to build an entirely artificial answer to draconic and serpentine power, rather than simply relying on living defenders the way it does almost everywhere else. A faith confident it had already fully absorbed or defeated its older rivals would have little reason to construct elaborate mechanical guardians specifically weaponized against exactly that older power. Their existence suggests the Golden Order took this threat seriously enough to engineer a permanent artificial solution, unwilling to trust living discipline alone, the way Messmer's own eventual fate would have proven it right to distrust, to keep something this old and this hungry reliably contained. There is a specific irony worth naming in the material these constructs are actually built from. Dragon remains rather than serpent remains, repurposing one older power specifically to guard against another. That choice suggests the Golden Order understood something worth sitting with, that dragons, however old and however displaced, could still be trusted, dead and disassembled, to serve the newer order's own defensive purposes. Serpents apparently earned no such trust, dead or alive. Whatever made serpent power specifically dangerous did not end simply because a given practitioner or a given creature had already been killed. The threat this world's own defensive architecture suggests was never fully trusted to stay defeated even in death. We are going to look now at what Messmer actually did with his own considerably more organic army, and why it required an entire region purged to make room for his own particular rule. It is worth noticing what the existence of a purpose-built answer implies about the timeline. Institutions do not engineer specific countermeasures against hypothetical threats. They build them after something has already gone badly, and the shape of the countermeasure is a fossil of the problem that produced it. So a machine designed to answer draconic and serpentine power tells you two things at once. It tells you the Order took that power seriously enough to spend real resources on it. And it tells you the Order expected to face it again, in the open, at scale, rather than treating it as a settled matter from a defeated age. You do not build a standing answer to a thing you believe is finished. There is a further implication in that engineering worth drawing out, because it changes how you read the Golden Order's confidence. A faith that genuinely believed its God had settled the matter would meet a resurgent older power with ritual, with prayer, with the assertion of authority. What this order built instead was hardware, cold, some mechanical, purpose-shaped hardware, designed by people who had evidently concluded that faith alone would not be sufficient if the thing came back in force. That is a quiet vote of no confidence cast by the Order's own engineers in the Order's own theology. Somewhere in the Golden Hierarchy, a decision was taken that the Serpent problem required a solution that would work whether or not the Greater Will was still paying attention. Given everything this world eventually reveals about how much attention the Greater Will was actually paying, those engineers were probably right. Chapter 9: Why the Land of Shadow was Purged. Before Messmer's own rule fully established itself, the Land of Shadow was home to an older population, Shadow folk, this world's scattered evidence suggests, with their own traditions and their own relationship to the region's own older, pre-golden powers. Messmer's crusade across this land involved considerable violence against exactly this population, a purge carried out, ostensibly, in the Golden Order's name, clearing the way for the Golden Faith's own authority to finally extend across an entire hidden region it had, until Messmer's arrival, never fully controlled. Notice the uncomfortable irony sitting inside that history once you hold it up against everything this chapter has already traced about Messmer's own nature, a prince carrying serpent power. The Golden Faith names its worst blasphemy, led a golden crusade against an older population whose own traditions may have had genuine, legitimate claim to whatever power he himself was already secretly carrying. He did not simply purge outsiders on the Golden Order's behalf. He may have purged people considerably closer, spiritually, to his own actual nature than the Golden Faith he was nominally serving on the surface ever was. This reading, offered carefully rather than as settled fact, suggests something genuinely uncomfortable about how this family's inherited relationship to forbidden power actually functions once it reaches full, weaponized maturity. Messmer did not resolve the tension between his own serpent nature and his family's golden faith by choosing one side honestly. He resolved it by using the very power his faith condemned to violently enforce that faith's own authority over people who may have understood and honored that same power more honestly than he himself was ever willing to admit doing. Consider, too, what psychological cost a campaign like this must have carried, whether or not Messmer himself ever consciously recognized the irony driving it. A man purging people who may have understood his own true nature more honestly than his own golden family ever did is a man, in some sense, purging a mirror, silencing exactly the voices most likely to recognize what he actually was underneath his fire-wreathed authority. Whether that purge was driven by genuine golden conviction, by a desperate need to prove his own loyalty beyond question, or by something considerably darker, a wish to erase the exact evidence that might have exposed him, this world's own text leaves carefully, deliberately unresolved. Before returning to the mainland's architecture, there's a smaller, quieter piece of the same purge worth naming, tied to a single village whose own name still carries the weight of what happened there. Somewhere within the Land of Shadow's own scattered territory, a village stands largely emptied, its former inhabitants gone or transformed, its buildings preserved just well enough to suggest what daily life there once looked like before whatever catastrophe actually emptied it. This world's own scattered environmental evidence, rather than any single confirmed account, suggests this specific settlement resisted the Golden Crusade sweeping across the region, clinging instead to whatever older tradition it had practiced before Messmer's own fire, and Scale arrived to enforce a different order. Consider what it means that this world preserves the physical shape of resistance, this thoroughly empty homes left standing rather than burned to nothing, as though the Crusade preferred to simply remove the people rather than erase every trace they had ever existed. That distinction matters. A conqueror interested purely in eliminating a rival tradition might reasonably be expected to raze everything associated with it, buildings included. Leaving the village standing, empty and undisturbed, suggests something closer to relocation or removal than to total annihilation, a detail worth holding on to given how uncertain this entire region's own history actually remains. Consider, too, what walking through a space like this one actually asks of a traveler willing to stop and pay attention rather than simply passing through toward the next objective. Empty homes carry a specific, quiet grief distinct from any battlefield or any dramatic ruin. Ordinary domestic space, hearths and doorways, and whatever passed for daily life, left standing exactly as it was, on whatever day the people who lived there stopped coming home. This world rarely slows down long enough to let a traveler sit with loss this ordinary, this undramatic. That it does so here, in a village most players will walk through without a second thought, deserves to be named rather than simply passed by. Before returning to the mainland's architecture, there is a considerably more portable kind of evidence worth gathering first, carried openly in the hands of countless tarnished who likely never once stopped to ask why so many weapons in this world carry the exact same word. The Purge is where the argument of this whole night stops being interpretive and starts being documentary, and it is worth being careful about why. Everything else tonight is a pattern assembled from carvings and item descriptions and the shapes of monsters. This is a military campaign with a commander, an objective, and a survivor population, and the Golden Line ordered it. What that gives us is a control case. If the Serpent were merely a monster this world happens to find distasteful, there would be no need to purge anything. Monsters are killed where they are found. Purges are conducted against populations, against practices, against something being transmitted from one generation to the next. The scale of the response is itself a statement about what the Order believed it was facing, and it was not facing an animal. Chapter 10: The Weapons That Keep the Name. Scan this world's own armory, and the word serpent surfaces considerably more often than convenient coincidence would ever explain. Blades, spears, and curved swords scattered across nearly every region carry serpent imagery worked directly into their design. Fangs, coiled hilts, venom-dripping enchantments, layered onto weapons whose original purpose has nothing obvious to do with Rykard's own singular blasphemy at all. These are not relics tied specifically to Volcano Manor, or to the Land of Shadow, or to any single named figure this telling has already walked through. They are simply scattered, generally quietly, across an entire continent's worth of armories, item shops, and forgotten battlefield loot, waiting for someone patient enough to notice the pattern, rather than simply equipping the strongest option and moving on. Consider what this distribution actually tells you, held up against everything tonight has already gathered. A single blasphemous demigod's own private obsession does not typically leave this many fingerprints scattered this widely across an entire world's weapon culture. Widespread naming conventions like this usually point towards something considerably more foundational, a tradition significant enough once that entire schools of weaponcraft built themselves around its imagery, long before any single figure like Rykard ever gave that older tradition a name harsh enough for the Golden Faith to finally take notice of. This reframes the serpent thread one final time before this telling gathers everything together. It was never simply Rykard's private blasphemy, contained neatly within one demigod's own monstrous transformation. It was, this scattered weapon culture suggests, a living tradition once significant enough to shape how an entire world armed itself, surviving now only in the residual shapes and names its weaponsmiths kept passing down, generation after generation, long after most of them had likely forgotten why a curved blade needed fangs at all. Consider, too, the specific effects several of these weapons carry: venom and poison enchantments layered onto blades that otherwise look like ordinary steel. This world does not typically attach poison to a weapon purely for decorative reasons. It suggests these blades were designed deliberately to channel something of the serpent's own nature into every strike, a small portable echo of the same devouring hunger tonight has already traced through Rykard's own total transformation, distilled down into something an ordinary soldier could carry and use without ever needing to understand or survive the process that first gave that hunger its shape. Before returning to the mainland's architecture, there is one specific blade worth naming directly. Dropped only by the very serpent transformed people, this telling has already gathered evidence of, carrying their own inherited shape directly into its own design. Among the weapons carried specifically by this world's serpent transformed folk, a curved blade survives them, taken up by any tarnished yet willing to defeat one of these forgotten, coiled figures in whatever cave or tunnel they happen to be found in. Its own design echoes the very bodies it was drawn from, a weapon that reads less like something separately forged and more like something grown or shed directly from the same transformation that claimed whoever carried it before you. Consider what it means that this world lets a weapon this specific survive its own bearer's death and pass, freely, into the hands of any curious tarnished willing to search for it. Unlike Rykard's own more famous, more guarded transformation, or Messmer's own carefully controlled inheritance, this blade offers something considerably more democratic, direct, physical proof of the serpent tradition's own reach, available to anyone patient enough to hunt through the exact caves and tunnels this telling has already named as its favored, hidden territory. Whatever this power actually is, it left behind considerably more evidence than a single dramatic transformation or a single exiled prince's own leashed restraint. It left behind ordinary weapons, carried by ordinary victims, waiting quietly in the dark for whoever eventually comes looking. Before returning to the mainland, there is one further weapon worth naming, considerably rarer and considerably more consequential, drawn directly from the demigod this entire telling began with. Defeating Rykard grants access to a blade, forged specifically to accomplish what ordinary steel cannot, ending a being that has already proven itself capable of consuming a god and an ancient dragon both. This weapon does not simply commemorate his defeat the way an ordinary trophy might. It represents the specific, deliberate solution this world's own careful design settled on for ending exactly this kind of devouring hunger, a blade built to be swallowed rather than swung, turning the serpent's own greatest strength, its capacity to consume anything placed in front of it, into the precise mechanism of its own undoing. Consider what it means that this world required a purpose-built weapon at all to finally end a threat this old. Ordinary demigods fall to ordinary combat, however difficult. Rykard's own ending required something considerably more specific, a weapon designed around the exact shape of his own particular vulnerability. That specificity suggests the god-devouring serpent's hunger was never simply another obstacle among many. It required a solution this world's own architects clearly understood needed to be built with genuine care, a fitting final piece of evidence for a threat this telling has spent so long establishing as considerably older and considerably more dangerous than a single demigod's own private tragedy could ever fully explain. Consider, too, what it says about this power that ending it required turning its own nature against it, rather than simply overwhelming it with superior force. Nearly every other demigod this telling has traced elsewhere falls, eventually, to sufficient strength applied directly. Rykard's own ending required something closer to a trick, exploiting the exact same hunger that made him dangerous in the first place, letting him consume his own undoing without ever recognizing what he was actually swallowing. That vulnerability, hunger itself becoming the exploit, deserves to be read as its own small, quiet irony, a devouring power finally undone, not by resistance, but by feeding it exactly what it always wanted, one final fatal time. We are going to return now to the mainland and look at where this same serpent imagery has been hiding. quietly, on architecture nearly every player has already walked past without a second thought. Gather all of these weapons together and notice what they have in common beyond the word itself. They are not relics of a defeated faith, quietly preserved by scholars. They are functional equipment, carried openly, used routinely by people with no particular interest in what the names on them once meant. That is what successful erasure actually looks like in practice. The vocabulary survives because vocabulary is useful, and no institution can be bothered to rewrite a whole armory. The meaning does not survive because meaning requires somebody to keep explaining it. Every tarnished, swinging one of these is holding a piece of evidence for a tradition they have never heard named, which is precisely the condition the Golden Order spent an age working to produce. Chapter 11. The Carvings at the Gate of Divinity. Scattered across some of this world's oldest and most sacred structures, easy to miss entirely if you are not specifically looking for them, serpent carvings appear worked directly into architecture. The Golden Order itself considers holy gates, thresholds, and passageways carrying imagery that has no obvious place inside a faith supposedly built entirely around a golden tree, and its own singular, uncontested authority, present quietly, patiently, for anyone willing to actually slow down and look. The Gate of Divinity carries some of the clearest examples, serpentine forms worked into stonework surrounding one of this world's most sacred thresholds, present in plain sight for anyone patient enough to actually look closely at the architecture rather than simply walking through it, hurried toward whatever lies beyond. This placement matters considerably more than a passing decorative detail would, because sacred gates and thresholds in nearly every tradition this world otherwise draws from tend to carry imagery specifically chosen to represent whatever power the structure is meant to honor or guard against. A serpent worked into the very gate, marking a boundary this world considers holy, is not decoration. It is testimony, carved by builders who apparently felt this particular image belonged there, embedded permanently into stone long before the Golden Order's later official teaching ever got the chance to fully erase what it originally meant. Consider what this suggests about the actual age of serpent worship relative to the Golden Order's own claimed authority. A carving this deeply integrated into sacred architecture does not typically get added casually, after the fact, by builders indifferent to what the symbol actually represented. It suggests serpent imagery was present meaningfully at the very foundation of whatever tradition first raised these gates, present early enough and importantly enough that later builders, even working under the Golden Faith's own authority, either could not or would not fully remove it. Consider, too, what it would actually take, practically speaking, to remove imagery this deeply worked into load-bearing stonework once an entire gate had already been raised around it. Later builders inheriting a structure like this one faced a genuine choice: tear the whole gate down and rebuild it from scratch, purely to erase a symbol nobody outside a small circle of scholars would likely even recognize anymore, or simply leave it standing quietly and trust that most travelers passing through would never think to look closely enough to notice. This world's own surviving architecture suggests they chose the second option again and again across gate after gate, leaving behind exactly the kind of overlooked evidence tonight has spent so long carefully gathering. Before turning toward this world's rivers, there is one more piece of buried, sacred ground worth naming, already touched briefly tonight, but deserving fuller attention now that its context is fully gathered. The consecrated snowfield, this telling has already established as a hidden sanctuary the Golden Order worked to erase, deserves closer examination now that every other thread tonight has gathered, sits ready to inform how you read it. Its own name carries the word consecrated, a designation implying sacred purpose, and yet no surviving text within this world ever directly explains what that purpose actually was, or which tradition originally consecrated ground, this remote, this deliberately hidden away from anywhere, the Golden Capital's own official ceremony typically reaches. Consider what it means that this specific field houses both a hunter dedicated specifically to killing the serpent responsible for Fortissax's own transformation, and an ancient hero this telling has already named as a guardian, whose original purpose remains similarly unexplained. Two separate pieces of unresolved, buried significance, sharing the exact same hidden ground, suggest this field was never simply an isolated curiosity. It reads, held up against everything tonight has gathered, like a genuine ritual center for this world's older buried traditions, deliberately relocated far from the Golden Capital's own gaze, consecrated by a faith the Golden Order eventually worked hard enough to erase that even this world's own careful text no longer remembers, or is no longer willing to say, exactly what was once consecrated there. Consider, too, why a field this significant would end up buried beneath permanent snow rather than left in whatever ordinary landscape once surrounded it. Snow, across nearly every tradition this world otherwise draws from, carries associations with preservation, stillness, and suspended time, ground that does not simply erode or forget the way ordinary uncovered earth eventually does. Whether this world's own designers chose that setting deliberately or simply for atmosphere, the effect reads the same either way. Ground this significant, buried under conditions that happen to preserve it rather than erase it, waiting quietly for exactly the kind of patient traveler willing to dig deep enough to actually notice it was ever significant at all. Before turning toward this world's rivers, there is a considerably wetter thread worth pulling next. Consider where these carvings actually are, because the placement is the whole argument. Nobody hides something in the foundation of their own most sacred architecture by accident, and nobody puts a rival symbol there as decoration. There are two readings, and both are uncomfortable for the official story. Either the serpent imagery predates the golden construction, and the order built directly on top of a site that already belonged to something else, which makes the Erd tree's own holiest ground a conversion rather than a founding. Or the imagery was placed there deliberately by the builders, in which case the faith incorporated the very thing it later condemned at its own center at the beginning. The golden account has room for neither. Chapter 12: The Water That Remembers a Different Shape. Beneath the surface world, rivers and lakes wind through buried caverns connecting Nokron and Noxtella, the erased cities this telling has already traced elsewhere, their waters carrying an eel, adjacent, serpentine quality distinct from anything the mainland's own ordinary rivers ever demonstrate. Creatures dwelling in these depths, coiled and aquatic, extend the serpent's own territory beyond dry caves and volcanic stone into the buried water table itself, one more overlooked corner of this world, quietly reinforcing the same pattern. Tonight has been tracing all along, patient and hidden, running silently beneath ground most travelers will never think to look under. Consider carefully what it means that this older, buried tradition keeps surfacing specifically in water, in rivers running beneath erased cities, in flooded tunnels most travelers have no reason to ever wade through. Water, across nearly every mythological tradition this world clearly draws inspiration from, carries associations with the primordial, the formless, and the endlessly ancient, the substance every creation myth eventually has to reckon with before dry land and ordinary order can finally take shape. A serpent tradition surfacing consistently in exactly this element suggests something worth sitting with quietly, that whatever this power actually represents may be considerably closer to this world's own primordial condition than to any later, ordinary rival faith competing on equal footing with the golden light, older, perhaps, than the very idea of competition itself. Consider, too, quietly, what it means that this same buried water connects directly to Nokron and Noxtella, the erased cities this telling has already established as casualties of the Golden Order's own war against everything older than itself. If the Serpent's own tradition genuinely runs through the exact same buried water table, quietly connecting those erased cities, then its own suppression may never have been a separate campaign at all. It may have simply been one more casualty of the same broader war this world's golden faith already waged against every older city, every older current, and every older god sharing that same buried, primordial ground, all of it erased together, quietly, patiently, in the same slow, cumulative campaign, rather than through any single dramatic, isolated conquest anyone at the time would have recognized as a war at all. Before turning toward the founder of the faith herself, there is a common confusion worth clearing up first, because two of this world's oldest, most visually similar afflictions are considerably easier to mistake for each other than most travelers ever realize. Scarlet Rot and Serpent Power share enough surface texture, decay, transformation, an origin considerably older than the Golden Order's own authority that a careless traveler could reasonably mistake one for the other, especially given how frequently both cluster around exactly the same volcanic, buried and forgotten territory this telling has already spent so much of tonight patiently mapping. Held up against each other honestly and carefully, though, they represent two genuinely distinct forces tied to different origins, different bearers, and different relationships to this world's oldest layer of buried, competing tradition. Consider the specific, careful distinction worth drawing here. Rot ties back to a saint's own patient cultivation, and to Melania's own inherited, war-winning curse, a force of decay and regrowth that consumes and transforms, but does not, so far as this world's text ever confirms, carry any coherent will or hunger of its own. The Serpent, by contrast, reads as considerably more active, a devouring, patient intelligence capable of consuming gods and dragons alike, growing and absorbing power deliberately, rather than simply spreading passively the way Rot appears to. Both are old, both predate the golden light considerably, but conflating them risks missing what makes the Serpent specifically dangerous enough to earn this world's single harshest word, a word Rot itself, for all its own considerable horror, never actually receives and never quite seems to deserve once the two are held up honestly, carefully, side by side. Consider, too, quietly, what it means that Rot earns a saint's gentle cultivation, while the Serpent earns only condemnation and secrecy. That quiet asymmetry in treatment, one older power tended openly by a recognized saint, the other hidden away and punished the moment it surfaces, suggests the Golden Order's own fear was never simply about decay or age. It was about intention, carefully weighed. Rot, however devastating, reads as something that simply happens to a person, absorbed and quietly endured rather than actively chosen. The Serpent, by contrast, requires a willing, fully deliberate act of surrender. A faith can find room to tend a passive affliction with quiet compassion. It apparently cannot forgive a son who reached out willingly and chose his own transformation deliberately. We are going to look now at the strangest thread of all, the one connecting this serpent imagery directly back to the very founder of the faith that claims to despise it. It is worth being precise about why water keeps recurring here because it is easy to treat as atmosphere. Water in this world is where things go to be forgotten. Nokron and Noxtella sit beneath it. The Lake of Rot sits beneath everything. Liurnia drowned an academy and never receded. A tradition that keeps surfacing in rivers and lakes and flooded ruins is not a tradition that failed and vanished. It is a tradition that was submerged, which is a different operation with a different implication. Things that vanish are gone. Things that are submerged are still there, intact, under a surface that most people never break, waiting for the water level to change or for somebody to go down and look. Chapter 13: A Queen's Old Habit. This next thread deserves to be offered slowly and carefully, as genuine open theory rather than settled textual fact, because the evidence here is scattered, circumstantial, and considerably thinner than the carved stone and the named titles tonight has already walked through. And yet, it is worth naming directly, slowly, because enough careful readers of this world's scattered text have noticed the same pattern independently for it to earn a place in tonight's telling. Marika's own iconography, scattered quietly across statues, symbols, and the visual language surrounding her golden throne, carries occasional details that some careful observers read as serpentine, curling motifs, imagery that has no clear place inside a faith built entirely around tree branches and golden light, present quietly enough that most players walk past it a dozen times without ever consciously registering what they are actually looking at. If this reading holds even partial weight, it deepens, quietly, everything tonight has already traced considerably further than a single blasphemous demigod or a single exiled serpent-bound prince. It would quietly suggest that the very founder of the Golden Order herself carried some quiet, unacknowledged connection to the exact power her own finished religion would eventually name its single worst possible sin, the same quiet pattern running through nearly every corner of her family's history, an older, buried nature surfacing in golden or omen children alike, hidden quietly here, if the theory holds, in her own iconography, present from the very beginning, long before Rykard ever gave the family's oldest secret a name harsh enough for anyone to finally take seriously. There is a further, quieter piece worth naming here, tying this theory back to a thread worth following at length. If Marika's own flesh really did carry a shamanic capacity for melding and dividing, a capacity older than the Golden Order and buried quietly beneath everything the finished faith eventually built on top of it, then a quiet serpentine echo running through her own iconography would fit that older nature perfectly. Serpents, across nearly every tradition this world otherwise quietly draws from, carry associations with shedding, transformation, and the crossing of boundaries between one state and another, exactly the same territory Marika's own capacity to become two people at once already occupies. If she carried this quiet power, the serpent may not simply be a stray decorative echo. It may be the oldest, truest, quietest symbol of the very nature she spent her entire existence building a golden religion to carefully disguise. Consider, too, quietly, what it would mean for Rykard's own story specifically, if this theory holds even loosely and carefully. A son, condemned quietly by his mother's own finished religion for blasphemy, reaching toward a power that may, if this careful reading holds, trace back to something quietly present in his own mother's iconography the entire time. That would make his own quiet transformation read less like rebellion against his family's nature, and more like the single most honest expression of it available to any of her children, reaching not away from his mother's own true self, but directly quietly toward it, closer, in his own monstrous way, to Marika's oldest and least performed nature than any of his golden, tree-favored siblings ever actually managed to get. Before that smaller piece of evidence, there is a broader question worth asking, one this telling has been circling all night without ever naming outright why a serpent specifically, rather than any of this world's other available monstrous shapes. The care required to read this evidence honestly is worth naming, because it is the point at which this whole night could tip into wishful pattern matching. Marika's associations with older shapes are real, they are recurrent, and they sit in the game's own text rather than in fan invention. But association is not identity, and a founder emerging from an older tradition is the ordinary way founders emerge. What makes this specific case worth pursuing is not that Marika came from somewhere. Everyone comes from somewhere. It is that her finished religion reserved its single harshest word for the tradition she most plausibly came out of, and then spent an age making sure nobody could easily check. That combination, origin plus prohibition plus erasure, is rarer than it sounds, and it does not usually indicate innocence. There is a final piece of this worth placing carefully, because it is the point where the whole night's argument either holds or collapses. If Marika did come out of an older tradition and then outlawed it, that is not, on its own, unusual or even especially sinister. Founders routinely suppress what they came from. It is one of the most common patterns in the history of any faith, and it usually reflects genuine conviction rather than cynicism. People who leave something behind are frequently its harshest critics, precisely because they know it best. What lifts this case out of the ordinary is the completeness. Not merely a doctrine against the old practice, but a purge, a sealed realm, a reserved word, an armory full of names nobody can explain, and a founder whose own history is so thoroughly unavailable that reconstructing it has occupied an entire night. That is not a founder distancing herself from an earlier belief. That is an institution ensuring the question cannot be asked at all, and the difference between those two things is the difference between conviction and fear. Chapter 14. Why a Serpent specifically? This world offers no shortage of monstrous ancient shapes. A rival tradition might plausibly, quietly have chosen as its own central symbol wolves, tied already to the ancestral, beast-rooted traditions, dragons, whose own considerable weight this telling has already carefully distinguished from the serpent's own separate lineage, or simple raw giants, brute and elemental, tied to whatever came even before the dragons held their own age. The serpent's own specific quiet selection, held up against these other available options, carries meaning worth naming directly, slowly, before this telling closes. Consider carefully what a serpent specifically represents. Across nearly every older tradition, this world's own design clearly, quietly draws inspiration from. Wolves and bears carry quiet associations with loyalty, pack, and inherited lineage, fitting neatly alongside the ancestral worship this telling has already traced in other regions. Dragons carry quiet associations with raw elemental sovereignty, an older kind of kingship this world's own dragon lords once apparently quietly held. The serpent carries something quietly different from either shedding transformation and a specific patient capacity to consume and absorb rather than simply loudly to dominate outright. Given everything this entire long telling has gathered about a family defined by splitting, fusing, and quietly transforming into shapes its own official teaching refuses to fully acknowledge, the serpent may simply, quietly be the single most accurate symbol available for what this family's oldest, buried nature actually truly is. Not a rival king, not a rival pack, simply a patient, transformative hunger, waiting, coiled quietly for exactly the kind of surrender this entire family's history keeps circling back toward generation after quiet generation, whether any single member of it ever consciously chooses that surrender or not, willingly or otherwise. Before that smaller piece of evidence, there is one final comparison worth drawing, tied directly to kingship itself and to what the serpent's own quiet relationship to legitimate rule actually looks like held up against the dragon's own older claim to it. This world's dragon lords, this telling has already quietly noted, once held a form of authority, the Golden Order eventually displaced, an older kingship, draconic and elemental, that at least claimed to rule openly and loudly, however long ago that rule actually finally ended. The serpent's own power, by contrast, never appears to have claimed kingship at all, not openly, not through any surviving record This telling has managed to gather across an entire night's worth of searching. It quietly consumes, it transforms, it hides inside households and bloodlines. But it does not, so far as any evidence tonight has actually found ever suggests, seek to rule. Consider what that quiet absence actually means, held up against the ambition nearly every other power this telling has encountered clearly demonstrates. Dragons once ruled openly. The Golden Order rules openly right now. Even Rykard's own household deception was ultimately aimed at quiet survival and secrecy rather than at open conquest or replacement of the throne itself. The Serpent's own hunger appears to want something considerably, quietly stranger than kingship, not the throne, not open rule, simply consumption itself, patient and total, content to grow larger and hungrier without ever needing the Golden Order's own crown to validate that growth. That may be exactly why this world's finished golden faith fears it more than it ever feared the displaced dragons. A rival seeking your throne can eventually be negotiated with, defeated, or outlasted. A hunger seeking nothing but more of itself has no throne to take from you, and therefore no point at which taking it back would ever actually satisfy it. Consider, too, what this specific kind of ambitionless hunger might actually be harder to defend against than open conquest ever was. A rival army marching on your capital announces itself, gives you time to prepare, gather allies, and mount a defense. A hunger with no interest in your throne, content simply to grow quietly in whatever corner it happens to occupy, gives you nothing to prepare against, no clear moment when the threat becomes visible enough to organize a response. Rykard's own blasphemy went unnoticed for years, not because the Golden Order was careless, but because a threat uninterested in your crown simply does not trip the alarms an institution built entirely around defending that crown was ever designed to notice. We are going to look now at a smaller, quieter piece of evidence, easy to miss, tucked into a side quest most players never fully complete. There is one further property of the Serpent worth adding to this list, and it may be the most relevant of all. A serpent sheds. It leaves behind an entire intact shape of itself, recognizably the animal, completely empty, and continues on unchanged underneath. For a religion whose central promise is that nothing is ever truly lost, that everything returns into the tree and comes back again, an animal that survives by discarding its own former self is not merely unclean. It is a working counter-argument, walking around in the world, demonstrating a different way of persisting through time that requires no tree, no cycle, no gathering of the dead, and no permission from anybody. That is a considerably more threatening thing to have in your world than a monster. It is worth adding one more property to this list because it may explain the specific intensity of the disgust better than any of the others. A serpent has no fixed direction. It has no limbs to face forward with, no posture to stand upright in, and no natural orientation the way a person or a horse or even a dragon does. It moves by becoming the shape of the ground it is crossing. To a religion organized entirely around verticality, around a tree that goes up and a light that comes down and a hierarchy of beings arranged between them, an animal with no up and no down is not merely unclean, it's unreadable. The Golden Order's whole moral architecture depends on things having a proper place and staying in it. The Serpent has no proper place, occupies whatever space it is in, and reorganizes itself continuously without ever ceasing to be exactly what it was. There is no position on the ladder for a thing like that, which means the only available responses are to invent a word for it or to pretend it is not there. This world's golden faith, in the end, did both. Chapter 15. The Hunters Who Were Given Special Weapons. Somewhere near the consecrated snowfield, a hidden sanctuary that served as a ritual ground, the Golden Order worked hard to erase, an NPC offers a specific, dedicated weapon built specifically for hunting an enormous serpent said to threaten the surrounding region. This detail is easy to dismiss as simple environmental flavor, one more optional side encounter scattered among dozens of others. This world offers its more thorough explorers, easily missed entirely by any traveler, moving quickly through this cold, remote corner of the map. Held up against everything else, tonight has already gathered, though. It deserves a second look. A weapon built specifically and only for killing a serpent, offered near a sanctuary already established as the site the Golden Order worked to erase and hide, suggests the serpent threat in this specific region was never simply an isolated wildlife problem. It reads instead like one more small, scattered piece of evidence for a war this world has been quietly fighting against serpent power for considerably longer than any single demigod's own individual blasphemy could account for on its own. Someone, long before Rykard's own transformation, already understood that ordinary weapons were not sufficient against whatever this power actually was, and built something specifically, deliberately to answer it. Before gathering everything together, there is a fuller story worth telling about the man who actually offers that weapon, because his own grief reaches back to the exact same dragon this telling has already named as the serpent's very first meal. The hunter waiting near the consecrated snowfield carries a specific, singular grief, and it is worth naming plainly, slowly, rather than leaving it as background texture to a simple weapon exchange. He lost his own legs, his own family, and by his own account, nearly everything else that once made his life recognizable to him in an encounter with Fortissax, the same ancient dragon this telling has already traced as the god devouring serpents' first known victim, consumed and twisted long before Rykard ever arrived to add himself to the same hungry shape. This hunter's entire remaining existence, dragging himself across frozen ground on ruined legs, orbits a single consuming purpose, reaching Fortissax again and finishing what that first catastrophic encounter left unfinished. Consider what it means that this world places a survivor of Fortissax's own violence this close to a sanctuary already established as a site the Golden Order worked to erase. If Fortissax's own transformation, dragon consumed into serpent-adjacent monstrosity, genuinely predates this family's entire recorded history, the way this telling has already argued, then this hunter's own grief is not simply personal tragedy. It is living proof that the god-devouring serpent's hunger was never contained to myth or ancient record. It has continued reaching into ordinary lives, generation after generation, long after its first, oldest victim was already lost to it, still capable, all these centuries later, of reaching an ordinary traveler who never asked for any part in this world's oldest, buried war. There is a specific, quiet tenderness worth naming in how this world lets you eventually meet him again, deep within Farum Azula itself, close enough to Fortissax that his own decades of pursuit finally reach their conclusion. Whether that ending reads as triumph, release, or something considerably sadder than either, depends entirely on how honestly you have been listening to everything his own grief has already told you. A man who built his entire remaining identity around a single act of vengeance does not necessarily find peace simply by finally achieving it. Sometimes, the pursuit itself becomes the last thing still holding a person together, and finishing it costs him something. This telling is content to let you sit with, rather than resolve neatly on his behalf. Consider, too, the specific detail of his own ruined legs, dragged rather than walked, a body permanently altered by his encounter with a power this telling has already connected to fusion and transformation elsewhere in this world's wider story. It is worth naming how thoroughly this world associates grafting and physical alteration with power too large for an ordinary body to survive intact. This hunter's own ruined legs fit quietly into that same pattern, a body reshaped not through his own choice, the way Godric's grafting or Rykard's own surrender were each chosen, but through simple, involuntary proximity to something considerably larger than himself. Even survival in this world apparently leaves a mark, whether or not the survivor ever consented to carrying it. We are ready now to gather everything tonight has traced and ask what it was all actually pointing toward the whole time. The pattern behind these special weapons is worth stating on its own, because it is the same pattern the fire giants demonstrate on the far side of the map. When this world wants something dealt with permanently, it does not rely on ordinary force. It commissions a specific instrument, gives it to a specific person, and points them at a specific target. What that tells you is that the thing being hunted was not considered manageable by normal means. Ordinary soldiers, ordinary blades, ordinary faith, you were all judged insufficient. Somebody with authority looked at the problem, concluded it required a purpose-built answer in the hands of a chosen bearer, and arranged one. That is the highest compliment an institution can pay to an enemy, and this world has paid it to the Serpent more than once. Chapter 16. What predates the tree? There is a strong case that older worship, tied to dragons, to giants, and to powers the Golden Order eventually worked to suppress or absorb, existed in this world long before Landal's own gates were ever raised. Tonight's serpent thread fits directly into that same older layer, one more piece of evidence for a buried tradition. This world's finished golden faith spent generations trying to write out of its own official account of itself. Gather every thread tonight has already walked through, and a coherent shape finally emerges. Serpent carvings worked into some of this world's oldest sacred architecture, present before the Golden Order's own authority was fully established. A single word, blasphemy, reserved specifically for whoever turns back toward that older power. The harshest vocabulary a newer faith keeps in reserve for exactly the threat it fears most. An entire noble household secretly serving a devouring serpent while performing loyal service to the golden capital in plain sight. An exiled prince who chose containment and discipline rather than surrender, weaponizing the very power his own family's faith condemned. A queen whose own iconography may carry quiet, unacknowledged traces of the exact same buried tradition, and a dedicated weapon built and offered near a sanctuary already known to be erased, proof that someone understood the scale of this threat long before any single demigod's own story ever gave it a name. None of this reads, gathered together, like scattered coincidence. It reads like a rival faith, older than the Golden Order itself, never fully defeated so much as buried, carved into gates its finished conquerors could not quite bring themselves to fully remove, surfacing again and again in the blood of a family that has never, across this entire world's long history, managed to stay simply, singularly golden. Consider, too, how this pattern sits alongside this world's other buried, displaced traditions. Wolves and ancestors erased from Nokron, dragons pushed to the margins of their own once dominant age, the Crucible's own fused, unashamed martial discipline entombed beneath the very capital it once helped found. The Serpent was never the only rival power the Golden Order worked to bury. It was simply, apparently, the one that frightened this world's finished faith most thoroughly, earning a word none of these other, equally buried traditions ever received. Every other displaced power gets treated, at worst, as an embarrassing footnote. Only the Serpent gets treated as an active, ongoing threat, still worth naming, still worth fearing, centuries after its own worship was supposedly safely finished. Sit with that comparison a moment longer, because it deserves real weight. A faith confident in its own total victory does not typically maintain a single word this harsh, this specific, for a threat it genuinely believes finished. Blasphemy is not the vocabulary of history. It is the vocabulary of ongoing vigilance, maintained generation after generation by an institution that never quite stopped watching for exactly the kind of return tonight's entire telling has spent hours gathering evidence of. The Golden Order did not simply remember the serpent out of historical thoroughness, it kept the word sharp and kept it in active use because some quiet, institutional part of itself never fully believed the threat was actually gone. There is one final contrast worth drawing between the two men tonight has spent the most time with. It is worth being honest about the limits of what can be established here, because this is the chapter where the evidence thins and the temptation to overreach is strongest. Nobody in this world stands up and states that a serpent god ruled before the Erd tree arrived. No item description says it, no character declares it. What exists instead is a shape, assembled from absences, a word reserved for one thing, carvings in the wrong places, weapons whose names outlived their meaning, a region purged and sealed, a founder whose origins keep pointing somewhere the finished faith forbids anyone to look. None of those is proof on its own, and any single one could be explained away without much effort. It is the convergence that carries the weight, and convergence is how you read a world that never explains itself directly. There is also a simpler test available, and it is worth applying. If the serpent were genuinely insignificant, a leftover monster from an older age with no claim on anything, the Golden Order's behavior toward it would be wildly disproportionate. Institutions do not purge regions and reserve their harshest theological language for creatures they consider unimportant. The intensity of the response is itself the measurement. Whatever the serpent actually is, the Order treated it as a rival rather than as vermin, and the Order was in a considerably better position to know than we are. There is one more consideration worth adding before this argument closes, and it concerns what the serpent never did. For a power this world treats as its ultimate blasphemy, the serpent has a conspicuously thin record of atrocity. It did not raise armies, it did not purge a region, it did not seal a realm behind a gate, or wall a population into a sewer, or hunt anybody across a continent for the shape they were born with. Every large-scale act of organized cruelty this night has passed through was committed by the golden side of the ledger. That asymmetry deserves to be stated plainly, because it is easy to lose inside the vocabulary. The word blasphemous carries such moral weight that it does the work of an argument without ever making one. Strip the word away and look at the conduct, and the tradition being condemned turns out to have a considerably lighter record than the tradition doing the condemning, which does not make the serpent benevolent. It only means the charge was never really about harm. Chapter 17, Two Brothers, Two Directions. Rykard and Messmer never appear in the same room together across this entire story, and yet held up against each other, their two very different relationships to the exact same inherited power tell you almost everything tonight has been trying to show you. Both men carry serpent power tied back to this world's oldest buried tradition. Both men were pushed in their own separate ways toward the margins of their golden family's official story. And both men, faced with that same inheritance, chose almost perfectly opposite paths through it. Rykard chose total surrender, merging so completely with the god-devouring serpent that almost nothing recognizably human remains, his own household secretly serving a hunger that has fully consumed whatever separate identity he once carried. Messmer chose discipline instead, containment, control, weaponizing his own serpent rather than dissolving into it, building an entire military authority out of a power he never stopped carrying, but also, crucially, never let fully carry him away in turn. Neither path, held up honestly against the other, reads as simply the correct one. Rykard's surrender cost him everything recognizable about the man he once was. But it also, in its own monstrous way, achieved a kind of total, uncomplicated power his own half brother never quite matched. Messmer's discipline let him keep his own name, his own face, his own recognizable identity intact. But that same discipline required him to spend his crusade purging people who may have understood his own inherited power more honestly than he was ever willing to admit doing himself. Both men, in the end, paid a price tonight has already found running through nearly every corner of this family's story, whichever direction they eventually chose to carry their own inheritance. Consider, too, what their two separate titles actually reveal once held up side by side. Rykard earns the Golden Faith's single harshest word, blasphemer, worn openly, however secretly his actual practice needed to remain. Messmer earns no equivalent condemnation, ruling openly as a prince despite carrying the exact same forbidden inheritance. That asymmetry deserves real weight. Discipline and containment, apparently, can earn a demigod continued standing within the family's own official story, however exiled and however distant his own rule remains. Total surrender cannot. The Golden Faith, it seems, can tolerate its worst power being carried quietly, carefully by someone who never lets it fully show. What it cannot tolerate and cannot forgive is watching one of its own sons choose to become that power entirely, openly, with nothing left of the golden performance, still standing guard over what he actually is underneath it. Consider one final piece of this comparison before moving on, tied to a thread running through this family's whole history. Omens, this family's own hidden cursed children, carry a roughness the Golden Faith works hard to hide away, exiled and sealed rather than openly acknowledged. Held up against Rykard and Messmer's own respective choices, the Omen curse reads like a third distinct model for how this family's oldest, buried nature can surface, involuntary rather than chosen, inherited at birth rather than sought out through ritual or research. Where Rykard chose his own surrender and Messmer chose his own discipline, Morgo and Moog and every other omen this telling has already gathered were simply born already carrying the family's older nature, given no choice in the matter at all. That comparison widens tonight's own argument considerably. This family's oldest, buried inheritance was never simply available to those bold or desperate enough to go looking for it. Sometimes it arrived unbidden, at birth, carried in blood nobody within that body ever consented to receive. Let that contrast settle for a moment. Consider, too, what it might mean that these two brothers, given everything separating their two chosen paths, still ultimately end up in remarkably similar positions by the time this world's own story finally reaches them, encountered as bosses, fought and defeated, their own respective inheritances ultimately unable to save either one of them from a tarnished's own blade. Total surrender and careful discipline, held up against each other honestly, both led to the exact same ending. Whatever this family's oldest, buried power actually offers its bearers, permanence does not appear to be part of the exchange, whichever direction a given bearer eventually chooses to carry it. Before closing, there is one final figure worth naming, someone this telling has not yet mentioned, whose own story may be the quietest evidence of all for everything gathered tonight. Set the two brothers side by side one last time, because the comparison answers a question this night has been circling from the first chapter. Both men were given the same inheritance. Both were touched by the same buried power. Both ended as something the golden histories would rather not describe in detail. Rykard's root was appetite. He wanted to consume gods, and he found a thing that consumes gods, and he let it have him in exchange for the capacity. What survives of him is hunger, with a face attached, presiding over a household that feeds it. Messmer's root was obedience. He was given something at least as dangerous, and he spent his entire existence holding it closed on behalf of a mother who then sealed him and his whole realm behind a gate rather than acknowledge what she had done. Neither of them ended well, and the shape of their failures is instructive. The one who took the power for himself became a monster the Order could name and condemn. The one who held it in service became a monster the Order had to hide entirely. Given the choice between a blasphemer it could point at and a loyal son it could not explain, the Golden Order found the loyal son considerably more dangerous and buried him deeper. Chapters 18 The Serpent Nobody Ever Named. Somewhere in this world's more obscure corners, item text and scattered dialogue gesture toward a serpent tradition even older than the god-devouring serpent's own hunger. References thin enough that no single confirmed story can be built from them, but consistent enough that they deserve honest acknowledgement rather than silent omission. This world's own text seems to know more about serpent worship than it ever directly tells you, hints scattered deliberately thin, as though whatever originally happened to this tradition was significant enough that even fragments of it needed careful, deliberate scattering rather than a single findable account. Consider what it means that this world would go to such trouble to keep even the scraps of this tradition scattered rather than gathered. Nearly everything else this telling has traced across 2 long nights now eventually resolves into a coherent, locatable story, however tragic. The serpent tradition alone resists that resolution, offering carvings without full explanation, titles without full context, weapons without full history, a consistent pattern of partial evidence that never quite completes itself no matter how many corners of this world you search. That incompleteness may be the most honest evidence tonight has to offer. A tradition this world's finished golden faith wanted thoroughly erased would look exactly like this, present everywhere in fragments, complete nowhere, precisely because completeness was the one thing its conquerors were never willing to allow it to keep. Consider, too, what it means for you specifically, as the one gathering these fragments now, centuries after whatever original erasure first scattered them this thin. This world was never actually designed to hand this story to you complete. It was designed to let you assemble it yourself, slowly, patiently, the exact same way an actual historian might reconstruct a genuinely lost tradition from surviving fragments, a carving here, a title there, a weapon whose name outlived the reason it was given that name. Tonight's entire telling has been, in that sense, less an act of storytelling and more an act of reconstruction, piecing together a shape this world's own careful design, scattered specifically so that piecing it back together would require exactly this much patience. Before that final image, there is one more question worth sitting with, tied to the very Elden Ring itself, the fractured object every demigod in this story keeps fighting over. This telling has already established, across an earlier night, that the Erd tree serves as a vessel wrapped carefully around a piece of considerably older, stranger power the Golden Faith inherited rather than originally created. Consider what it might mean if the Serpent's own oldest tradition once held some relationship to that exact same underlying power before the Golden Faith arrived to claim, rename, and reshape it into the tree and ring this world's current age now organizes itself entirely around. This reading deserves to be offered as the most speculative theory tonight has to offer, resting on considerably thinner evidence than nearly anything else this telling has gathered, and yet the pattern is worth naming carefully rather than left unspoken simply because it cannot be proven outright. If the serpent tradition genuinely predates the golden light the way tonight's evidence suggests, and if the golden light itself is genuinely wrapped around something older than the tree that carries it, then the serpent may not simply be a rival faith competing alongside the Golden Order. It may be one of the oldest surviving names for the exact same underlying power the Golden Faith eventually renamed, reshaped, and rebuilt its entire civilization around, worshipped once under a considerably older, considerably more honest name than the one this world's current age ever learned to use. If that reading holds even loosely, it would explain, more completely than any single other piece of evidence tonight has gathered, exactly why this word blasphemy carries the specific weight it does. Reaching for the serpent would never simply be reaching for a rival tradition. It would be reaching directly for the same underlying power the golden faith itself has always secretly depended on, simply approached honestly under its older name rather than dressed in tree branches and filtered through generations of careful, golden performance. Rykard's own blasphemy on this reading was never really a departure from his family's own true nature at all. It may have been the single most direct, unmediated contact with it that anyone in this entire story ever actually achieved. There is one final image worth sitting with before we let this whole telling finally close, tied not to any single fight or any single carving, but to the shape of Erasure itself. The quietest evidence is often the most reliable, precisely because nobody thought it was worth managing. Grand claims get edited, official histories get revised. What survives untouched is the small stuff that nobody considered load-bearing at the time. That is the category this last figure belongs to, and it is why the detail matters more than its size suggests. An institution conducting a thorough erasure will find and remove the monuments, the scriptures, the obvious statements. It will not think to remove an offhand description attached to an ordinary object, because the person doing the removing does not recognize it as evidence either. The gaps in an erasure are not where the censor was lazy. They are where the censor genuinely did not know something was there, which suggests a method for the rest of this world beyond tonight's subject. If you want to know what a religion has buried, do not read what it says about its enemies. Read the things it left lying around, unremarked in the hands of people it did not consider important, and see which names keep appearing in places the official account has no reason to put them. Chapter 19: What Erasure actually looks like from the inside. Consider one last time before closing what it must have actually felt like to live inside this world during whatever transition first buried the Serpent's own older worship beneath the Erd tree's rising light. Not a single dramatic battle, most likely, decisive and clean. Something considerably slower and considerably more ordinary, temples quietly repurposed, carvings left standing because removing them proved more trouble than simply building something newer and brighter beside them. A generation of children raised without ever being told what their own grandparents once knelt before in the dark. That ordinary, unglamorous texture of erasure deserves real weight because it is considerably more honest than any single dramatic conquest story could ever be. Faiths rarely die in one decisive moment. They die slowly, through neglect, through newer generations, simply never being taught the old words, through carvings left standing because nobody in power considered them dangerous enough to bother removing, right up until a demigod, with nothing left to lose, finally reached back far enough to prove that danger had never actually gone away. Consider finally what this slow, ordinary erasure suggests about every other quiet loss this world's own long history has already asked you to witness across every corner of this world. Erd trees planted over buried cities, names quietly dropped from golden teaching. Traditions reduced, generation by generation, to nothing more than a carving nobody currently living can fully explain. This world's entire golden civilization, examined honestly, was never built on a single, clean, decisive act of conquest. It was built, slowly and patiently, on exactly this kind of quiet, cumulative forgetting, one generation at a time, each one a little further removed from whatever their own grandparents actually knew and quietly chose or were quietly forced to stop passing down. We are ready now Finally, to close. There is a particular cruelty in this kind of erasure that is worth naming plainly because it is different from ordinary destruction. A tradition that is destroyed still has victims who know what happened to them. They can grieve it. They can pass on an account of it, however partial, to whoever comes next. Erasure of this kind removes the grieving as well. It leaves a population carrying weapons named after a thing they cannot identify, walking past carvings they cannot read, using words whose origin nobody living can supply. Nothing hurts because nothing is remembered as having been lost. The wound closes over so completely that the people standing on top of it would sincerely deny there had ever been one. That is what makes it so effective and so difficult to argue against from the inside. The Golden Order did not merely defeat whatever came before it. It arranged the world so that the defeat itself became invisible, and so that anyone who noticed the fragments would be reaching for a conclusion the available vocabulary no longer had a word for. Tonight has essentially been an attempt to reconstruct that missing word from the shape of the hole it left. It is worth asking what an erasure of this scale actually costs the institution performing it, because the cost is never zero, and it usually shows. Maintaining a silence is not a single act. It is a permanent expense. Somebody has to keep the region sealed. Somebody has to keep hunting the populations that carry the older traits. Somebody has to keep producing the doctrine that explains why the harshest word in the language belongs to one particular shape. An order that had genuinely defeated its predecessor could simply stop, the way it eventually stopped worrying about the dragons and let them keep a shrine in the open air. The Golden Order never stopped. That is the detail that undercuts its own account most thoroughly. The permanence of the effort is an admission that the thing being suppressed was never actually finished, and that everyone at the top of the order knew it. You do not spend an age holding a door closed on an empty room. Chapter 20. The God That Never Actually Left. Here, at the very end of tonight's telling, the word blasphemy finally makes complete sense, in a way it likely did not the first time you heard it attached to Rykard's own title, back before you understood everything else tonight has since gathered. Blasphemy was never simply a word for a demigod who did something monstrous. It was, this entire night has argued, the specific, harshest vocabulary a newer faith reserves for anyone who reaches back toward whatever it replaced and never fully managed to erase. The serpent was never simply a monster waiting in the dark for careless travelers to stumble across. It was, if tonight's gathered evidence holds together the way it appears to, this world's actual, older god, worshipped before the Erd tree ever rose to dominate the skyline. Carved into gates its conquerors could not quite bring themselves to fully chisel away, surviving in bloodlines its own golden faith would spend generations trying to convince itself had been fully, safely purified. Rykard did not invent a new sin when he merged with his serpent. He simply reached back far enough and honestly enough to touch something that had been waiting patiently the entire time for exactly the kind of surrender he was finally willing to offer it. Consider, one final time, everything tonight has actually gathered. A dragon, ancient and formidable, consumed generations before any demigod ever gave this hunger a name, and a dragon lord left broken and alone by that same loss. A general who chose total surrender over resistance, and a household that served him faithfully, some knowingly, most not, without ever fully agreeing on what it was actually kneeling to. A prince across the sea who chose containment instead, weaponizing the very inheritance his own family's faith condemned, and a purge he carried out against people who may have understood his own power more honestly than he ever let himself admit. Gates carved with an image no golden builder would have chosen freely, and a hidden, snowbound field this world still refuses to fully explain. A queen whose own oldest nature may have never been quite as singular or quite as golden as her finished religion needed the world to believe. And a hunter, somewhere near a sanctuary already known to be erased, handed a weapon built for exactly this threat, long before any of the rest of tonight's evidence ever surfaced to explain why he needed it. Let that settle fully now. Whatever this world's golden faith spent generations trying to convince its followers was safely, permanently defeated. The evidence scattered across an entire continent's worth of carved stone and buried bloodlines suggests otherwise. It was never gone. It was only ever waiting, coiled quietly beneath the golden light, for someone patient enough, or desperate enough, or simply honest enough to finally stop calling it blasphemy and start calling it, once again, by whatever name it originally answered to before this world ever decided to be afraid of it. Consider one final quiet thought before we let this whole telling rest. Every single thread gathered tonight, the dragon consumed before any demigod ever arrived, the household that served without knowing, the prince who chose containment over surrender, the carvings no builder dared fully remove, the queen whose own oldest nature may have never been fully golden, the hunter who spent his whole remaining life chasing one dragon across an entire frozen world. Every one of these threads points toward the exact same quiet, patient truth. This world's golden light was never as total or as uncontested as it needed its own faithful to believe. Underneath every golden surface, in every buried city, every forgotten cave, every carving nobody thought worth removing, something older has simply been waiting this entire time, coiled and patient, for exactly the kind of attention tonight has finally given it. Before we close, there is one last thing worth holding, and it belongs to the listener rather than to any figure in this story. Every night spent inside this world eventually arrives at the same discovery, approached from a different direction. Underneath the golden surface, there's always something older, still present, still intact, that the surface would prefer nobody examined. The buried cities, the sealed realm, the prince rooted beneath the capital, and now this, coiled quietly through the foundations of the faith itself, never destroyed, only unnamed. The Golden Order's real achievement was never that it won. Plenty of orders win. Its achievement was that it made the winning look like the natural condition of the world, so that everyone born afterward would mistake the arrangement for the ground itself. And the serpent, whatever it actually was, remains the clearest evidence that the ground was arranged, because a thing has to have been there first in order to be worth burying this thoroughly. There is a final, gentler thought worth carrying forward as well, beyond simply the fear this world's finished faith apparently still carries. Whatever this older power actually is, it never once demanded worship through conquest, the way the golden light eventually did across nearly every region this telling has already walked through on other nights. It simply waited patiently, coiled beneath the surface, content to be found rather than to force the finding. That patience, held up against everything else tonight has gathered, may be the single gentlest thing this entire buried tradition ever actually offered anyone willing to go looking for it, honestly. Let your own body settle now, the way this world's oldest buried power apparently never stopped waiting to. There is nothing left to solve tonight, nothing left to chase. Only the shape of something ancient, coiled, and endlessly patient, still resting quietly beneath every golden surface you have ever walked across without knowing it was there, content for now, simply to have finally been seen and named honestly by someone willing to listen all the way to the end.